So I want to talk to you a little bit about the one job we most easily forget that we have, the job of being a citizen. And I want to start by talking a little bit first about something that happened before 1846, someplace close to this place, Walden Pond, near Boston, when this man, Henry David Thoreau, wrote the following sentence. He said, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." So this is a picture of a 14-year-old boy. It's a picture of an epidemic in America. The number of kids who are obese in America has tripled since 1980. For kids over 2, 1/3 are now technically obese. This epidemic has costs. The most interesting, tragic cost is actually with type 2 diabetes, a kind of diabetes that used to only afflict older people. Now half of the new cases come from kids. The cost of this is $147 billion in direct healthcare costs every year. Now the question is, why have we produced this epidemic? Well, when I was a kid, I used to think, because I was fat, that this was about genetic problems, but it's a little bit hard to imagine a whole generation of kids genetically becoming overweight unless we've got this weird new intervention from outer space. No, instead, it's because of what we eat. There's a consensus among people who know something about the matter that we eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. And not actually this stuff, it's more the high fructose corn syrup that is now in 40% of the products in your supermarket. Now you might ask, why is that? What has happened? And the answer is that sugar is expensive relative to corn. And free market types look at that and say, well, that's just what the market says, and we're going to work around how the market teaches us we have to eat. But it's not quite so simple, because of course, sugar is expensive in America because we have tariffs that protect 6 domestic sugar manufacturers. It gives them about $1 billion in extra profits every year. It costs the American economy about $3 billion in efficiency loss, because sugar is about 2 to 3 times the cost in America as in our competitive countries. And corn is so cheap in America because the government subsidizes it. $74 billion in the last 15 years. Some economists estimate the cost of growing corn is actually negative. You get paid to grow corn. So you take these two facts, sugar and corn, together, and what we see is a radical shift in the cost of food. So between 1997 and 2003, the cost of vegetables went up by 17%. The cost of a Big Mac went down by 5.4%. Cost of a can of Coke went down by 35%. And then we also see a radical shift in how food gets made. Some of you might have seen this extraordinary film, Food, Inc., which talks about the way that corn, because it's so cheap, can now profitably be fed to cattle raised in these kinds of conditions. Not so profitable for the cattle, because of course corn's not the sort of thing that a cow's stomach can digest easily. Instead, you've got to feed the cow all sorts of antibiotics to deal with the diseases that corn breeds inside of their stomach. And those antibiotics then begin to breed plenty of this E. coli, which if this were now a film, we'd cut to some 4-year-old boy who died because of a hamburger that he had eaten. All of this because corn is so cheap and sugar is so dear. Now here we are in Texas, we got to ask the obvious question, why is there so much anti-free market silliness here? What explains it? And the political scientists would say, well, nobody can prove why this is like this, but here's what we can say. There's an extraordinary amount of campaign cash in this story. Sugar producers give millions of dollars to campaigns to continue to get their protective tariff. And companies that build on corn spend millions of dollars to continue to get government subsidies for corn. And if it's because of these campaign contributions, then we can say campaign money distorts the market, which distorts food production, which distorts our kids. Now, that's one story. And if I had endless time, which I'm told I don't have endless time. Okay, if I had endless time, we could go through an endless list of such stories, right? Think about Wall Street. We've just seen this extraordinary collapse on Wall Street. Why was there that collapse? Fantastic book here by Simon Johnson and James Quack, talking about this perverse mix of deregulation and re-regulation that Wall Street lived under. The deregulation happened in the 80s and the 90s. In that period, we had a whole bunch of financial innovations, brilliant new ideas like CDOs and synthetic seed, all these sorts of crazy, amazing new devices which were to make our world safe for modern finance. But these innovations were invisible to the market. And the reason for that was the deregulation allowed them to be kept off the public books. So in 1980, Frank Partnoy estimated these numbers for me, 98% of the financial assets in our economy were traded in a public way, registered and monitored by regulatory agencies about how they were performing. By 2008, 90% of our assets in our economy were invisible. They were in this shadow banking market, which encouraged the bubble, which eventually broke our economy's back. All of that because of this structural deregulation. But then there was this re-regulation. As the bubble got bigger, the government signaled through a bunch of regulatory changes that when the bubble burst, there would be a bailout on the other side. So we produced the dumbest socialism ever invented by man, socialized risk, privatized benefit, the kind of heads they win, tails we lose kind of structure. An insanely stupid way to run a financial system. Why did we do it like this? Political scientists would say, none can prove, but here's what we can say. The fastest growth in campaign contributions in the 80s and 90s in our political system came from this one sector. Or think about the Deepwater Horizon. Many people look at this and say, how is it we could have such an importantly experimental set of drilling going on without any effective environmental impact or risk studies? In my part of the country, we've just spent 9 years and 10,000 pages of environmental analysis to be able to build this green energy system that will be Cape Wind project off of the Boston Harbor. So the question was, what happened in the context of the Deepwater Horizon? The answer was 17 pages of environmental impact statements before the government exempted them from any further requirement to demonstrate the safety of their new technology. When Congress heard this, of course, they said, we're shocked.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much.
But of course, it was Congress that had required this insane approval system that made it so they could pass these systems off within 30 days. Why did Congress do this? The political scientists will say, none can prove, but this is what we can say. Endless campaign cash inside this system. And finally, think about the healthcare debate. Did Barack change Washington with the healthcare debate? My friend Ezra Klein at the Washington Post, after the healthcare bill was passed, said that there was a twilight of the interest groups in this case. What we had was Obama succeeding and neutralizing every single industry. Not quite true, Ezra. Here's what Glenn Greenwald said, and I agree with Glenn in response to Ezra. If by neutralizing, Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefit, then he's absolutely right. But of course, the way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it had to be done that way, but one cannot deny that it was. Evoking the words of the 20th century's greatest philosopher, David Byrne, same as it ever was. Now, the point is, in all of these cases, we have good souls hacking at the branches of evil, none who is striking at the roots. Now here's a question for you, good souls, hacking at the branches of evil. Do you have a root? Because I do. I'm here to give you the root. It looks a little bit like this. And I don't mean cash in the Rob Blagojevich sense of bribery. I don't mean cash that's given out in brown paper bags, corrupting in the old-fashioned quid pro quo sense. I mean cash at the core of the economy described in this extraordinary book by Robert Kaiser, So Damn Much Money. So damn much money fueling this economy that defines how our government works. Lobbyists benefiting members, who benefit special interests, who benefit the lobbyists. Producing an important kind of dependency, where the members become dependent upon the special interests, producing this marionette government. Now, it's a system of dependence. Keep that word in the center. And it's not the dependence that our framers intended. The framers of our Constitution gave us a republic, by which they meant a representative democracy. And the crown jewel of that representative democracy, described in Article 1 of our Constitution, was Congress, an institution, the branch of the federal government, as Federalist 52 put it, which ought to be dependent upon the people alone. That was the dependency they intended, upon the people. Upon the people alone, but that's not the dependency we have. The dependency on the people has been replaced by a dependency upon the funders. Members spend between 30 and 70% of their time every single day on the phone raising money to get back to office or to bring their party back into control. They develop a sixth sense about what they will do that might affect the willingness of their funders to continue to fund them. They become shapeshifters in the old X-Files sense of the word, bending towards what they know they have to be in order to get their money. This woman, Leslie Byrne, who was a congresswoman for Virginia, describes when she first got to Congress, one of her colleagues said to her, "Always lean to the green." And then she added, "He was not an environmentalist." The people have been replaced by the funders, and here's the obvious point, right? Why isn't this the most obvious point anyone could ever remark? The funders are not the people. What they want, what they demand, is not the sort of stuff that the people would want and demand if, in fact, that's what the representatives listen to. That alternative dependency is corrupting. Not of congressmen. I don't think that we've got evil, corrupt congressmen. It's corrupting of Congress. The institution is corrupted. It's the institution that is the problem. Now, political scientists look at this and say, you know, we've done the numbers. We're not quite sure whether money is actually driving results here. But here's what we can be sure of. We can be sure of this one belief that most Americans have, that money buys results in Congress. Indeed, overwhelmingly, Americans have this belief that money buys results in Congress. In the surveys I've been a part of, 88% in California, 88% in North Carolina. Overwhelmingly, this is the belief people have, and this belief has an effect. Rock the Vote did a poll just 2 months ago of young voters that they had brought into the system last election cycle. And a significant number of these voters are not going to be voting in 2010. The number one reason why they are not voting, 2-to-1 higher than the second top reason, and for the first time appearing on this kind of poll, was no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. Now, it's not just the kids who have this view about our government. The vast majority of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, will not vote in the next election because they have this belief. Why waste their time when this is what the system is? Now, what do we do about this? So you might see I'm wearing these really cool shoes. They're Teds. You should get them. Because they're made by this company, Stride Rite. Stride Rite was made by this man, Arnold Hiatt. I want to tell you a story about Arnold Hiatt, a little bit of a hero of mine. So he's shy. This is the biggest photograph I could find on the web of Arnold Hiatt. doesn't like to promote himself much, and he's a loyal Democrat, controversial down this part, as I understand, but okay, he's a loyal Democrat. 1996, he was the second largest contributor to the Democratic Party in the country. So in 1997, Bill Clinton invited him and 30 other of the top Democratic contributors to the Mayflower Hotel for a dinner of these fat cats, where the fat cats would tell the president what the president should do for the next couple of years of his administration. So each got up and spoke, and Arnold was the last one to speak. And he stood up. We don't actually have a picture of it. I kind of envision it like this. But Arnold gets up to speak to the president. And he says to the president, "Mr. President, I know you're a big admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's mind in 1939. When Roosevelt realized he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy." As Arnold said, you too, Mr. President, have to do exactly the same thing. You have to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, a war against fat cats, people like us. People who believe that merely because we have a lot of money, we have the right to control how government executes its policy. People who believe that just because they're rich, they can pick up the phone and get the president on the other side or a senator on the other side. People who have destroyed this democracy. As you can imagine, in this room of fat cats and the president, there's a little bit of silence when Arnold was finished with his speech. He sat down. The only published account we have of this night says that Clinton's response effectively slashed Hiatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Because, of course, the view was, we didn't come to power to give power away. But I think 14 years later, what we need to do is to recognize that Arnold Hiatt was right and the president was wrong. We need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. But Arnold Hiatt was wrong in the way he thought this war would be waged. It will not be waged by politicians. They're not about to change the system that brought them to power. It's a war that gets waged by us, by citizens. It's a war that starts with a movement that identifies changes that would change the way this democracy works, changes that a Republican 102 years ago first proposed Teddy Roosevelt to produce what we could call citizen-funded elections, elections where candidates get elected through small dollar contributions only, so that we could have a democracy where we all could believe, as we all want to believe, that the reason Congress did whatever stupid thing Congress did was because there were too many Democrats or too many Republicans, but not because of the money, making trust in this institution possible again. Now, when the Constitution was finished and Ben Franklin walked out of the convention, he was stopped by a woman on the streets of Philadelphia who said to him, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And Franklin said, "It's a republic if you can keep it." A republic, a representative democracy, a system dependent upon the people alone. We need to recognize we've lost that republic. But you need to join us to get it back. Thank you very much.